Hey neighbors, welcome to Around the Lake podcast. I am once again on a walk with Fletcher and Watson. It is November, late November. It's Sunday. I gotta look at my watch, but I think it's the 19th. And it's not the 19th, it's the 17th. And it's beautiful out. It's just balmy, right? This is October weather, not November weather. There's a full moon, or there's nearly full moon. I think last night or Friday night was a full moon. The lake trail is just glowing, and the white limestone is just glowing in the moon. A fog is settled in over the prairie, and Fletcher and Watson are sniffing. It smells different at night, I guess, than during the day. The edges of the trail. This week our guest is John Wasik, author, journalist, elected official, and neighbor since 1999, when Prairie Crossing was still brand new. We talk in our conversation about one of his books that I read in preparation of this interview, Lincolnomics, and the impact Lincoln had on how we grow as a people economically with internal improvements and colleges and land grant colleges and what we did to the native peoples of this land, and really a refreshing look at Lincoln as a mini Civil War buff. I've enjoyed everything about Lincoln is about the war, and John's book is not. It's about what Lincoln did despite the war. So there's plenty here if you're not a Civil War person, but there is a conversation. So, and about, again, it kind of focusing on conservation, really because of that development that we've seen since Lincoln, the 1830s. Our prairie is almost gone, as we talked about with Jim O'Connor last time. Speaking of last time, it's been a minute. It's been a month. I planned to do these every other week. It just didn't work out with some of the interviews I lined up and some of the people I wanted to talk to. But we kind of needed that time, didn't we? Lots changed since that last podcast. The whole world's changed, and maybe not the better for conservation, but maybe sometimes in opposition, conservation efforts actually do better. I don't have it in front of me since I'm walking, but during the George W. Bush administration, there was a lot of progress made. So let's hope, right, for all our sakes. And as I look up at that moon, I think I'd like, if anyone would like to join me on the next full moon walk, we could maybe lap the lake together, enjoy the darkness and the light that the full moon gives. Just appreciate being together in some of this beautiful surroundings. If you'd like to do that, go ahead and email me at aroundthelakepc@gmail.com. But anyway, here is John, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
Got a hot mic?
Yeah. All right, John Wasik, welcome to the Around the Lake podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Tell me about yourself. We don't know each other too well, so tell me.
Well, I'm an author and a journalist. I've written 19 books, working on my 20th, and published all over the place. I was a columnist for Bloomberg and Reuters for a while, and then I contributed to the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. Now I'm writing for Next Avenue, which is a PBS site. And, occasional piece for the Sun-Times, and, mostly the kind of writing I'm doing now is focusing on environmental topics and really how people can approach the subject on a hyper-local level. My new book is being serialized through my newsletter Substack called Refinement, and it's a serialized version of well, if you were to do something in your neighborhood, what would it look like? So it's a series of vignettes on people doing really important things on a daily basis. And that's what really gets my juices flowing.
Can you give us an example? What's one of those stories?
Yeah, well, so for example, I came across a couple of people who found a Rusty Patched Bumblebee. Now, for those people who are not engaged in bee lore, the Rusty Patched Bumblebee is a federally endangered species.
Yeah.
But I ran into 3 people who really didn't know each other at all, who had seen them and had documented them and sort of uploaded the images to an app called iNaturalist, and were confirmed. So it was like, how often do you see a federally endangered species, right? So as a forest preserve commissioner, I was like, yeah, well, where'd you see it? And they told me, and I can't tell anybody. It's like,
oh yeah,
if I
sure.
tell you, you have to get through security clearance, and that won't work. So it was just kind of a thrill. I mean, little things like that. So I do a lot of volunteer restoration work, local forest preserves. I've been doing it here at Prairie Crossing for 25 years that we've lived here. Occasional burn and, pulling invasive species, things like that. So all that is about building community in a very direct way, because you're doing something with somebody else that's very productive. I mean, I have to tell you, even in the middle of summer when there's bugs out and it's really hot and you're really sticky, you yank up a bunch of sweet white clover, and it's one of the best feelings. I don't know why. I mean, I do other things, like I bike all the trails and I hike, and we camp a little bit, and we do the things that a lot of people like to do. But, the most satisfying thing is like, hey, we worked with a bunch of neighbors to clear that area over there, and look at it now. It's really coming back. So lately it's more about creating habitat. So my origin story is, at least as an environmentalist and perhaps as a forest preserve commissioner, is that 30 years ago we lived in unincorporated Wakanda, and we had 2 horses. So we bought this really ramshackle ranch, and it was just place should have burned down. But we spent 9 years remodeling it and tending to the horses. My wife had a business. I was working in the city as a magazine editor on a terrible commute, and it was a beautiful piece of property with a 150-year-old cottonwood on it, and they had a barn that we had to fix up, and excuse me, the horses took up a lot of time. So it was one of those places where you had to love it to be there. And then, after a while, babies came along. We said, well, we got to have a really decent neighborhood in which to raise our 2 daughters. And so we started looking around. We came across Prairie Crossing. At the time, it was just half built. But I read a couple articles about it, and we started talking to people, and it was one of the nation's first conservation communities, meaning that, the homes were designed to be energy efficient for that time, which was 1999. No solar panels or anything, but, they did the best they could at that, time in history. And it had a lot of open space. It had a working organic farm, things we have today, which have really evolved over the years in a lot of interesting ways. But those are the kinds of things that really attracted us. When our girls are young, they were hen house helpers, and they collected eggs, and were always at the farm getting dirty and, really getting engaged in what was going on, all around them. And, we have an orchard across from us, and we live on Prairie Orchid. And it's an actively cultivated, place where you can get persimmons and apples and blackberries and raspberries and even pawpaws now that are coming along slowly. It's a very difficult fruit.
I saw an article about how warming climate might mean that pawpaws get more of a chance to make it to market. I couldn't believe that after I just learned what a pawpaw was. That here,
it's a very fickle fruit, unlike a banana, which you can keep on the shelf for about a week. Pawpaw, you got to sell it that day.
Yeah.
And it's just, you got to eat it right away, and it goes bad really quickly. But it's an interesting little fruit, and it's native too.
Yeah.
It'll be a while before we can grow bananas here. Hopefully it won't be that hot, but That's something we can grow here.
So your wife's is Kathleen. What are your daughters' names?
Sarah is the oldest, and she's living in the city and working on her MBA. And Julia is our youngest. She's also living in the city and working on her graduate education. And both went to Grays Lake Central High School.
Nice. When give us a visual, like when you first turned into Prairie Crossing to go look at building sites or your, house. I don't know if you built your house. What did it look like? What was not here? What was here?
Well, it was very much a work in progress. The trail behind our house was still a half-open road, which, construction trucks were going down. We were told it was going to be closed. And then I had sort of a tiff with one of the developers is like, we don't really want construction trucks, driving on the trail behind our house. So that was, resolved. But, most of the trails here were actually farm roads and later converted into our trails system. And then as we connected to other trails, it became, more of a sort of connection to the rest of the county. So one of the things that really appealed to me, and I'm an avid, biker on bicycles, and I could see that the trail connection would connect to the Forest Preserve trails. There wasn't a direct connection when we first moved here, but they're building an underpass under Milwaukee Avenue, and it connected to the river trail on one side, and there's Rollins Savannah on the north, which you have to go through some neighborhoods to get there. There's no real one trail to get there, but you can figure it out. It's not a big deal. But I love the fact that you could go from here to Wisconsin or Cook County pretty easily. On a bike. I mean, it's a good distance, but if you're really interested in biking, the trails here are excellent. And that was a big plus. And they've gotten better over the years, and we've been trying to extend a lot of trails in the Forest Preserve, and we just passed a referendum. Thank you for your support out there. And we're going to finish some more trails, like the Millennium Trail that runs right through Rollins, Savannah.
Yeah, I just read the Daily Herald article about that a week ago, maybe.
Yeah, we're going to get some capital projects done like that, and buy some more land, and people generally move here for the quality of life and the Forest Preserve. So we're going to enhance what we have and build upon a great legacy, and that part of that is Prairie Crossing's sort of in the middle of it, and it's it's accessible. I mean, could there be a more integrated community and to the rest of Grays Lake? I think so, but it's something that's happening slowly in terms of urban planning across the world. And, you can go to Jewel. It's faster to get there on a bike than it is driving.
Yeah. My son walks there sometimes.
Yeah, and you can walk there. You can walk to Ace or, bike there and go to Dunkin' Donuts or places like that. And that's a good thing. The more people who are doing non-motorized transportation, the better, for the climate and, for pollution, things like that. So that was a big draw, and I'm glad we're still working on that here. And, we still have some battles to fight and trying to watch what they're going to do with 120. IDOT's got a big sort of study in progress. I've been on that committee and trying to see that they don't build a much bigger highway that's going to be, unwieldy and cause a lot of pollution. So that's one of the many projects I'm involved in, and just transportation. And then the other one is to create the greenway that was the Route 53 corridor. That's got to be very complex, and it's evolving slowly, but working very hard on that. It's one of my top priorities as a county commissioner to see that gets done.
Yeah, it's when did you start with the county? So 99, you moved here, yeah? Is that what you said, or 96?
Yeah, it's funny, but when I first got in this house, I was thinking, the people who used to live here back then, the fellow who owned the house was a lawyer, John Wiley. He had run for county commissioner. He didn't win, but somehow some people got me interested, and my wife asked me to do it, and I said, I'm a journalist. I don't really like politicians. I have not had a good experience with it, but she said, you can work on environmental policy. That's what your real passion is. So I said, okay. And got got into office in 2018, won a second term, and have crafted a climate change policy. We're trying to get to net zero by 2040 and reduce our landfill input by 60%. I mean, all these are really ambitious goals, but it takes, concerted effort by the entire community to get it done. So I like working on things like that and getting things done, hopefully. So
just about 20 years after you moved here? You 99? Yeah, so you became commissioner then. And you're still a journalist.
Yes.
So I read Lincolnomics. I don't know if that's your most recent book.
Yes.
That's one. Okay, that's one that Wally Winter told me about too. He is the bookshelf behind you has a stack of his books on it because he asked if I knew anything about Chicago or Illinois when I moved here, and I said that I didn't, and that in fact we'd never actually considered moving here until we were given a choice. And he said, "But you're not against learning about it then?" And I said no. And then the next day he had a stack of books. So that's the most recent Wally Winter recommendation was.
Well, it's very kind of Wally. Wally's been a friend forever, and we always talk about local history, and Wally's got a lot more stories than I do. But Lincolnomics was a labor of love, and I did it during COVID. Most sane people were baking sourdough bread and sampling different kinds of wine extensively. I decided to write a book about Lincoln, and his real first focus was on public works and what they called, the American Plan, which was building infrastructure. And he had his eyes set on first, building canals to link Springfield to the rest of the world, at least to the Mississippi River system. And then he was a big champion of the I&M Canal, which literally created Chicago as not only a commercial center, but as a transportation hub. And from there, it was like, you go make a huge quantum leap to the interstate system and the rail system. Chicago's still a transportation hub. So Lincoln was focused on that, not just because he was into public works, but he saw it as a way to level the playing field for people who didn't live in big, eastern cities. And we would be connected to New Orleans and to the East Coast. I mean, you could get all the way from Chicago through the Erie Canal to New York City and Port of New York, and this was in the 1830s. So, the big first obsession was to build these canals that connect the waterways that we had. And then, of course, the railroads became our next sort of interstate transportation mode. And he was, he was a railroad lawyer for a while. And, just embedded in this idea of, well, if there is such a thing as economic equality, how do we do that? By building better infrastructure, bridges and tunnels and canals and ports and things like that. So it was a really, really fun project. I lectured all over the country about it, and I'm just always focused on, well, how did something get there? So I've done a couple of books on infrastructure that are based on stories of people who did really profound things. I did a book on Nikola Tesla, the great genius behind alternating current and our current electrical system. Sam Insel, who kind of built, ComEd and a few other things from scratch and gave us sort of this distribution network for electricity in the second industrial revolution. And sort of a lot of things in between. But I always like to ask the question, at least as a writer, is like, well, how do we get here and where are we at? So I still think we're in the sort of a transition where we have to determine is like, okay, in an era of climate change, how do we build better infrastructure? And if I've reached any conclusion, it's that we have to organize as communities to grow more food locally, to restore habitat, and to figure out what our communities should be like to be more habitable.
Yeah, so I have to say that Lincolnomics, at first I was like, so I studied history in college. After college, I got kind of, everybody, I guess, picks an era where they just really like. And part of mine was World War II era, but also, the Civil War era. So I've read, Team of Rivals when that came out, and I've read Shelby Foote's 3-volume series on Civil War.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah, he is so charismatic. It's easy. It's huge books, but they're easy to read because And yeah, he's pretty biased towards the South, but if you appreciate that, just his folksy writing is just fantastic.
Yeah, a friend gave me the 3-volume set, and so far I've gotten through volume 1, and I will finish the whole thing. I have a few other things to get through. But I love the whole antebellum period before the Civil War. And the remarkable thing is that the things that Lincoln accomplished, establishing the Transcontinental Railroad, the Morrill Act, which established land-grant colleges like the U of I and every state college just about, that all happened at the height of the Civil War. He established the first national bank, established the greenback as the dollar, system of currency. I mean, just all these incredible things that nobody really thinks of as happening during the Civil War. It's like Lincoln pushed all these things forward.
Yeah, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but to people that are interested in this, the smaller Congress must have helped, right? Not having an oppositional South to
absolutely.
To
I mean, the things that he needed to pass his real passionate projects were done a lot easier without having opposition from the southern states. That's just a political reality, and a lot of the things that happened after he was assassinated just kind of fell apart, except for the Transcontinental Railroad, which became a reality in 1869, and then it changed the country.
Well, what I have to say I appreciate about Lincolnomics, and what I was getting at was like, oh, another Lincoln book, but it actually wasn't, because it was not about the war, which almost every Lincoln book is about the war, and that kind of his origin story is often glanced over in the first few chapters of the book, and I felt like you gave it more of its due as to who he became. You also didn't forget where it came from, the land or whatever. And the first time I think I've read the phrase Euro-American, because if you're going to talk about Native Americans, that makes a lot of sense. But also I left with this sense of wonder about Lincolnomics, about this idea of industrialization, but then also here we are living with the consequences of that kind of industrialization. And still, the carbon dioxide admitted then is still here now and warming things up, and wondering if there's any point when, if they'd stopped, when you got to Eisenhower, I was like, that might have been the tipping point. That might have been too far, the car culture that we have. It's just interesting in reading, at one point being appreciative of the leadership and the vision of people like that, but then also realizing the consequences that we have to deal with now because of that is something I'm still thinking about after reading it.
Yeah, it's one of those tough, big questions where you can say as a social observer, yes, we need to rethink infrastructure, and that will be less carbon intensive. And then the second question is, like, how do we do that? I mean, there's a lot of people say, well, more electric vehicles, more public transportation, and there's a whole list of things. But, rethinking it means, how do we do this communally as a people so that we are changing our habits, and we're on bikes more, we're just, not in cars all the time, or we're walking more, or we're talking to our neighbors more. And I think the big revolution is going to happen on our front porches, where we just start talking to each other again. Mm-hmm. And we figure out, well, maybe it is a good idea if we're creating more habitat in your yards. Well, how do we do that? Well, we exchange ideas. We start saying, well, you don't want that in your yard. Or, one of the things we did a couple of years ago, there was a program called Conservation at Home, which was, well, now it's taken over by Open Lands, and I have a lot of friends over there. But the whole thing was like, well, what if you at least move towards naturalizing your yard, meaning more native plants and doing native flowers, creating habitat for Rusty Patch Bumblebees. And it's something that's foreign to a lot of people because, we grew up in this culture, the post-war culture is like, everybody should have that 1/4 acre, the lawn should be perfect, we should water it, we should fertilize it, we should put pesticides on stuff where there's bugs, and it's just like, it's hard to unthink that because it's such a cultural meme. But, if you're thinking, well, if you're creating habitat, it's a different mindset, but it's more comforting because nature is all around you. And if you're trying to create a an anti-habitat, then it's it's less beneficial to the planet. I mean, it's just something that we're just beginning to realize. So it's something where, once people think about it, my wife has a really great book club and everybody's invited. We're discussing Nature's Best Hope, which is a Doug Tallamy book. And it's all about, what if you turn your yard into like a park? And here's a really obscure fact that there's more acreage devoted to lawns across America than there is to all the acreage in all of our national parks. So what if, a significant percentage of that was, naturalized into, viable habitat? What would that mean? Well, it would absorb carbon. It would absorb stormwater. It would not need to be fertilized or covered with pesticides. And the chemical inputs would go down, and the amount of carbon absorbed by prairie plants would go up. It's something that requires a lot of thought and a lot of dedication. Believe me, I've been yanking a lot of stuff that shouldn't be in our yard, but it feels good.
Yeah, I feel like it's a little bit of a trade-off. I mean, I don't know if listeners could hear, but there's a lawnmower going in the background. That's my lawnmower. I share it with my neighbor. He has the more traditional lawn. I have more of a prairie lawn established by that couple that you talked about. I have no idea how to manage it still, 4 years in, but I'm working on it. He can be done. He's got to use gasoline for most of it to get his yard where he wants it to look like.
Mm-hmm.
I have to go out there and pull weeds and wear gloves and sweat a little bit. But again, then also I'm not raking leaves. I'm not blowing leaves. I leave them where they are, and then I run them over with the mower in the spring if they're in the little bit of grass that I have. So two different, like a contrasting world. I came here thinking that I didn't have to do any work because I hate yard work.
And if anything, it's more a matter of changing the narrative. So all of us are thinking, well, we should rake these leaves to the front so waste management can vacuum them up. I'm thinking, okay, what if I was creating habitat for fireflies, for bumblebees, for all sorts of, caterpillars and animals that will live under the leaves and, in an oak ecosystem, which we're trying to restore, will thrive. They need the leaves, and the leaves can be mulch for your garden. Or they just, they're just covering for, fireflies that need to winter over. I mean, just think of the last couple summers, it's been hard to see fireflies.
Yeah, there was that discussion about that in the middle of the summer on Psycho Chat, and just we sit out on our deck and just watch them. But it's been demonstrably less since even we moved here. And nothing that I can see has changed, at least in my little patch in the back. But yeah, it's hard to know, right?
I mean, the bad news is the bug population, mostly beneficial bugs, has crashed a lot because of loss of habitat and chemicals and stuff like that. But the good news is that you can restore it, and really, you'll see the benefits immediately, especially if you're, say, planting a pollinator garden. Habitat for monarchs and all. I mean, I was at a conference. I'm studying to be a master naturalist, and there's thousands of bugs that are pollinators that you wouldn't even think of. Like mosquitoes can pollinate. It's like, who would have thought?
I'd say honeybees are not necessarily, they're kind of cattle, aren't they? Honeybees are meant.
Well, most of the honeybees around here are European species, but there are native bees to Illinois that most people have no idea. It's like, yeah, there's bees native to Illinois. There's all sorts of species we probably haven't even seen. Most people don't know that 40% of Illinois was once forest. That, it's been kind of plowed over, but, and 60% of it was prairie. So
yeah, it's hard to celebrate. I was thinking about John Deere's plow, right, from your book. It's hard to celebrate that now in a way, because look what we've lost in a way because of it. I might not be here if he hadn't, but yeah, it's hard to think that was it less than 1% of natural prairies still in Illinois, right?
Yeah, it's like 0.0001%. It's just way to the right of the decimal point. But
basically none.
Is it being restored in some places? Yes. And there's like, I found this out. I was down near Northwest Indiana for a conference on Friday. It was down near where I grew up. And what was remarkable is that there was one area where my grandmother worked during World War II in a munitions plant, which had been restored to a national tall grass prairie. It's called the Medewan Prairie, down kind of near Joliet. It was called the Joliet Munitions Plant.
We stopped there on the way back from a vacation, and it was closed at the time. I desperately want to see buffalo out in the prairie.
Yeah, and they have buffalo out there. They have buffalo up at in Batavia, and it's like, well, the longer term plan is to create habitat for buffalo, which, they were part of the ecosystem. So we actually took, when my daughters were younger, we took them down to Medewa, and I was like, well, this is really how most of Illinois looked like. And, with the buffalo. And, buffalo they're not like border collies. They're not that friendly, but it's good to see them. And I talk to some Native Americans, and they have a special way of looking at it. But it requires a different narrative, a new story. It's like, well, how do we live better with the land? Well, we shouldn't regard, bugs as enemies. We shouldn't regard grass as the perfect thing for our yards. And it's okay if you want it and say your kids are still playing soccer. But, after that, it's like, well, there are other things you can do.
Yeah. Actually, we utilize on wild iris here that green patch in the middle that helps with stormwater management. But that's our front yard.
Yeah.
Throw the frisbee for Watson, who just left the room. Just our neighbors, we all picnic in there in the summer when we have get-togethers. Individual events happen in our backyards, but community happens in those shared spaces. And Calamus is like another great example. We love to go. We have little ones, so they play on the playground, and the dog, still on the leash, but loose, catches his ball and stays, nearby. That shared community on your front porch, I suppose, conversations are the pleasant part, I think, the most pleasant part about prairie crossing. I just wrote a little bit about the next Meadow Mix about George's Beach and the idea that we could have had a pool, and that George and Vicky said no, how about a beach instead, and that we might not have had that kind of communal space. In that way, a pool is communal space, but in that way, with the connection to nature, that if they hadn't made that decision, which is part of the reason that name was given to the beach.
And the whole principle behind the design of Prairie Crossing is to get people out talking to their neighbors. I mean, you look at typical suburbia, and I'm always studying this because I'm sort of a inveterate student of urban planning, is that like a lot of houses are designed without porches, and there's no real way to interact. They're like 3-car garages with attached homes.
Yeah. We purposely did not buy houses where the garage is the main feature. It really is the main architectural feature of a lot of homes.
And how do you facilitate interaction? It's like, well, porches are a great thing, and then trails, another thing, and then just, having them clustered together in pods the way they did here. And there was a lot of planning involved in that, and it was all designed to get people to like look at their neighbors and actually talk to them and interact with them. So that's still happening here. I mean, we've had waves of people come and go, and that happens everywhere. But it's important to say, well, why don't we just have a bonfire? And we do that, in our Prairie Orchid fire pit, which was designed for that purpose. Second Thursday of the month, and, unless the weather's really bad or some people are out of town. It was just, we make an effort, and everything's on the table. It's like BYOB, and it's like, what's going on?
Mm-hmm. And then there are little things like there is a bottle opener nailed to one of the posts that hold up the blackberries, right?
Yeah.
That like little nice touch. There are many down by the beach also. Just nice little tactile things that just facilitate life here. I think about those all the time. Like someone thought of that, I don't know how long ago, but they put that there. The little library that the Bar Horse children put up as part of their project, that we go to that all the time. down by the beach.
And some of the events are just enshrined in living here, like, Fright Fest is, I'm glad that's still going and more people are getting involved and some new faces. And I love unloading and loading kids onto the hay wagon. It's so much fun to hear them. You're like, oh, what's going to happen? It's like, keep your arms in, the zombies are hungry. Oh, they kind of look at me as like, what?
Yeah.
But, there's other things, like the Father's Day pig roast has been going on for a while. And the event leading up to that is Gary Zipfel, our neighbor, has sponsored the sauce making with the guys, and they're playing croquet. So it's just a really big fun thing. I was in a band here for a while that was called Prairie Fog, and we would play every St. Patrick's Day for a potluck. And
I think I went to the last one of those.
And that was so much fun because it brought people in, and we're playing jigs and reels and Johnny Cash and a whole bunch of stuff. But, it's the main point is like, well, how do you get people together? You have to do stuff, and you have to be deliberate about it. And you have to get them in one room or one space, or just kind of start talking to them.
I also find that, which is one of the reasons I don't appreciate the listserv, is that you are not looking people in the eye when you're having the disagreements that happen on there. And I kind of feel like when we have an event like that, those anxieties or disagreements or vitriol melts away when you see that person owns a house just like you do, and they are there for the pig roast just like you are, and that really we don't disagree on all that much if we are disagreeing on a certain issue.
And I think, and part of this was due to COVID, part of it was just our more, wired in age, is that we've become disconnected from the human reality. Is like, you really have to like talk to somebody, find out what's going on with them. Some people are going through some pretty bad times, or just things are not going well, and you can find out. Mm-hmm. But you have to engage on a much deeper level, and that goes beyond social media or listservs, and just understand is like, that's not real total communication.
Yeah. Now, 4 episodes in, I'm meeting people that I've never hung out with before. I started easy, with Wally and Ellen, and I wanted Sonny and Stuart on. We'll try to get them still, but more people have been in my house because of the podcast than we've had the neighborhood here, but that's about it. And just to get to know people like we're talking right now. I knew you as the county board member. I didn't know the connection with the forest preserve, but I knew that you cared deeply about it. And I read your newsletter as part of that work, but I didn't know anything about that. And Kathleen knocking on my door asking me to sign the ballot.
Yeah, and Kathleen was president of the high school board for a couple of years, and she served the community well and really helped transform Grays Lake Central into the great school that it is now, and actually helped establish the program where high school kids are learning at the farm now. So she was a big influence there, and it's all good because, when you're in high school, how often you get to go to a real farm and grow things and get credit for it. So I'm also working on an internship program with CLC. We get kids in the forest preserve and get credit and get paid and get some experience. It's like there's a lot of work to do. And my only plug for the forest preserve, anybody wants to volunteer to do restoration work, we always have openings. It's a great crowd. Yeah.
What are you working on now? You said you were close to having a book serialized.
Yeah, I'm working on my book, The Natural Neighborhood, and sort of looking for an agent and a publisher, and I might just publish it myself. I haven't really decided, but I do like 1 chapter a month, and then the rest of the newsletter is, things kind of leading up to that. I'm having so much fun with it because I don't have to report to an editor. I don't have to stay in my lane about a certain subject. I mean, for years I wrote books on personal finance and retirement, and they did okay, but it's not the same thing as something you are really deeply engaged in and believe in. So it's just a thrill. And the theme of it is refinement. So people ask me, are you retired? Are you going to retire? I was like, well, no, I'm in the process of refinement and trying to get better at what I really care about, which is a variety of things, but mostly writing, communication, speaking, and then, music and drawing to some extent and doing work out in the community.
I guess when people ask about retirement, it's about freedom to kind of do what you want. And it kind of sounds like you're actually doing what you want. So why would you consider yourself retired?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a question of doing less. It's a question of doing more that really counts. I mean, you have to do this very simple evaluation is like, well, what makes you feel most alive? And to me, it's a handful of things. I know exactly what they are. And, I like to be out in the middle of summer yanking sweet white clover with Jim O'Connor and my neighbors and talking and just doing stuff like that and working in my yard and riding my bike and exploring a new trail and just it's all part of the adventure. I mean, the narrative is to see what it is that you have not noticed and have maybe passed by a million times. So it's like finding that hidden detail in the ordinary. I was riding down a trail past Carmel High School, and I noticed this little sign that said Libertyville Nature Preserve. I was like, there's a nature preserve here? I've been by this a million times. I was like, what is this? There's a little sign on a spur, and the highway department put up a sign. It was like, turn left. Okay, turn left, go out the trail. Sure enough, there's a little nature preserve in between, suburban homes and two busy highways. And it's like, geez, I never knew this was here. And I used to live in Libertyville. It's like, how can that be? It's like, well, it's a discovery of something was like in nature and in your built environment. It's like, it's a wonderful serendipitous thing.
All right, well, let's leave it there. John Wasik, thank you so much for being on the Around the Lake podcast. I'm humbled to have you here.
Thank you, Dan. And if anybody wants to get a hold of me, the best way is through email, johnwasik@gmail.com. If you want to see my newsletter, I'll put you on the list. It doesn't cost you anything and you get off anytime. And of course, if you need to communicate to me about forest preserve or county matters, you can use that email too, and I'm happy to talk to anybody. I get back to everybody as best I can. So,
fantastic. All right. Well, thank you again.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, that's our episode for this week. I want to thank everyone for listening, and again to John for his time. I actually have now, and we talked about the drought of interviews. I think we are set through the end of the year. At least I have some contacts. So the podcast rolls on, and I meant it about my walk around the lake. If anybody wants to meet me at the next full moon, I don't know when it is, but we can talk about it. You can email me, reply back to my email, or aroundthelakepc@gmail.com. Had to get a generic email address for the podcast site. So join me, and if not, we will talk to you at the next podcast.